Okay, in this video, we are going to be talking about pipeline and organizing our projects. This will also touch on the school pipeline and a little bit of how that is created. This is really important to understand for working your group projects. If you guys do not follow this and you guys don't take these words to heart, then you guys are creating more work for yourself down the line and for your teammates as files break, you guys lose things, and stuff becomes unmanageable. So the first thing I want to say is that it's a good idea for you to go ahead and standardize which versions of software you guys are using as a team. Not having the same version of software can cause corruption issues. So it's a good idea for you to go ahead and agree early on which version of Maya you're going to use, which version of RenderMan. Some software that isn't going to be shared or isn't going to be like loaded in for final files like Substance Painter or maybe even Houdini or I'm not sure, ZBrush, right? Those things aren't as important. It's really the ones that you're actually going to be sharing files between. So if you're not going to be sharing files with anybody else when you're doing work, you don't really have to worry about this that much. Okay, so the first thing I want to mention is that describe what our school pipeline is. So our school pipeline essentially is a central drive space like you have on your computer for storing files. Okay, so the College of Architecture has a storage location that our visualization lab computers are hooked up to. And when we create files in the project space, they're actually stored here and backed up here. They're not stored locally on the computer unless you save things to the desktop, which you shouldn't do. Um, so within that drive, each of you guys have a space, especially when you create a new project, which you guys will cover at another time if you guys haven't done that before. So when you create a new project, you're essentially creating a folder space that stores all your files. And the cool thing about this is that this drive and your folders are actually accessible from every single computer that is hooked up to the pipeline, which is probably the majority of all the computers in Langford C. So as long as you're logging in to your user ID and then accessing your project, then you're able to access your files. And so you don't have to carry the files around. You don't have to upload them or anything like that. You can just log into another computer, even if someone's sitting at the computer you used yesterday, and you can just access them. Project, you're usually going to be create a project for whenever you're creating and working on a new assignment or a new project, as you might expect. Um, and so, for instance, if you were making a animated short project about an animated dog, right, and that dog is doing something, it's a short film, that entire short film, all of your assets, you could keep together packed in one project. And so it makes it easy to compartmentalize and kind of easily locate and track the files associated with a single project. Group projects is a modification of this. Group projects are like the same thing as project folders, but it is actually accessible by multiple people. And so this is great for when you're working on a team, because when you're working on a team, let's say you're making an animated short, right? Joe might be making the character model, Ashley might be rigging that character model, and then Paul might be texturing that character model, right? So they all need to access the same files, and so it makes sense to have a space where everybody is storing the same thing, or is storing all the projects related to the same project. Um, this happens a lot on group projects. You guys are going to be passing files back and forth, so this makes it a lot more efficient than simply having to upload, tell someone the files at this location on Google Drive, and then download it. So it just makes it as soon as Joey or Joe saves the character file into the project, then Ashley can immediately open that file from another computer and then start working on it. So this central location makes it a lot easier for managing your uh, asset files that you're collaborating on. Okay, so, and I apologize for the slides thing that keeps popping up. So what is referencing? So referencing is a really important aspect of working on larger projects and working on group projects. So what it does is that it allows you to bring in other assets from another file, like for instance, like the model file or the shading file, right? You can bring those objects within that file into another file. So if I'm creating the rig, right? So I'm creating the control system for my character, I can create a reference that pulls in the model into this space, right? If you're familiar with importing, this is kind of a similar thought process, right? You're taking a file from another file and bring it into your current file. But what this does is, what makes referencing interesting is that it actually creates a link between those two files. So the rig file and the modeling file now have this link. And what happens is whatever changes you make into the file that's being referenced into your current file. So for instance, if I made an update to my character model, even after I referenced it, what happens as soon as I click save, it's going to go ahead and um, update that file inside my current space. Okay, here's an example. I wanted to quickly draw this up so you guys can see what it looks like. Um, so we have our character model. And so we have this character file. This represents the file. So we have a character file. Inside it, we have this little alien looking dude. Okay. So my rigging artist on my team goes ahead and creates a rigging folder, or a rigging file. Sorry, these are both Maya files. Pretend these are Maya files. So he creates a rig file, and then he goes ahead and references that character model into the rig file. So it just boop, pops into the rig file when we reference it. So that's cool. The rigging artist goes ahead and starts creating controls, joints, weight painting the character, things like that. The character artist wasn't complete making the character, or let's say they had to go back and make a revision. So let's say they went ahead and added arms. As soon as they save that file, what happens is that change to the character actually gets pushed through the reference to the rig file. So when the rigging artist reloaded their own file, the rigging file, because of that reference, those arms now magically popped in for the character because the modeler made that change in the original file. So through referencing, you can create this kind of chain between these, or this link between these two files, that any changes you make into the first file is going to push through to the second file. So it's pretty easy to find and access and create references. All you really need to do is open up the file menu, go down to create reference, and just find the file type. There'll be a couple other options, or your Maya file. There'll be a couple other options for it that you can use, but generally all you really need to do is just use create reference under file, find the file, and load it in. Reference editor is where you can manage them. I'm not going to go into detail here, but essentially lets you reload references, unload references, delete or remove references. So it just gives you control over it. Importing is a lot like referencing, only in this case, there is no relationship between the, now there's no more relationship between the original file that you import, or that you're importing in, and then the file you're currently in. So as soon as you import it, it cuts all ties between those files. So if we use that that example I used earlier for referencing, here's my character Maya file with my character model in it. And I'm going to, I create my rig Maya file, and I go ahead and import the character in. So I use importing. And as soon as I do that, once I import, there's no longer a link or anything between these. Okay? So now if I go in and start rigging my character, set up controls, joints, weight painting, as soon as I go into the model file and make updates and save it, nothing happens, right? This file is going to stay the exact same because there's no longer a link between them because I used importing. So in this case, it's actually probably not a great idea to use importing over referencing. I just wanted to kind of illustrate that example. If I wanted to actually get this model back into the rig file, I'd have to import it again. And then once I've imported it, then it'll have the changes. But it's not actually the same model, so I'd have to do some other fixes. So it requires, if you want to replace a file you imported before with an updated version, it requires a little bit more work. But we'll talk about that when we go back to the reference, or the lecture. So as I said before, it breaks that link. So if you make any changes in the original file, it does not update in the new file, or the file that's imported in. So this is called destructive, right? That means you're making a permanent change to your workflow. The importing, though, isn't necessarily bad. Actually, importing is something you might use a lot. Generally, these are things that you don't really need to keep that referencing structure. In general, referencing is a little bit too, oh, what's the term? Referencing is a little buggy and a little bit hard to manage. You have to be very careful with how you're cleaning it up and you're managing all your references. Importing is actually very clean because once you import the model in, there's no outside linking or relationships between other files that you have to manage. And so it becomes super simple. So certain objects and really small objects that you want to use in your scene, I'd recommend importing in. Things that you know you're done with, you've already UV and wrapped it and all that stuff, and you just want to get into the file. Okay. So within our workspace, there are shot files and then there are release files. So these are two other types of files you're going to notice. And these are two other types of files besides our normal working files. So you'll be doing most of your work in what I would consider your working files. And shot files and release files are slightly different. So a shot is in a film is usually defined by a camera change. So as soon as like the camera changes viewpoints, it makes a cut, then that's usually considered a shot or a new shot. Shot files are usually broken up into separate Maya files based on what's happening in your film. So usually when you change your camera, not always, but usually when you change your camera, you in your film, so let's say I'm looking at one character and then the camera switches to look at another character, in some cases I might use another shot file. That's not always the case. Sometimes even though I might be switching the camera and making cuts, I might actually just use a single shot file for that, just because every time I do a new shot file, I have to set everything up again. And if there's like some kind of continuity between those shots that I want to preserve, then switching to a new Maya file might get kind of tricky to manage. Release files are versions of your files. Oh, right. One thing I want to say about shot files. So usually these are files at the very end of your project. So once you've gone through the whole pipeline from modeling all the way down to animation, shot files are usually where you're doing like your lighting and animation and you're getting ready to render. So those are the ones where you bring in everything. You're essentially setting the stage for the camera and you're about to render it off, or you're doing your animation or your lighting. That's towards the end of the pipeline. So release files are files that are essentially labeled as done and good to go. So for instance, this is really important for referencing. So it's essentially you're letting someone know that this file, this character rig file, this character model file is good to go. It's completely done. I'm not touching it, or I'm not currently working on it. And so it's safe for you to use it into another file, like referencing into the animation file. So why is this important? Multiple people will often be working on a lot of files in your group. So you're doing a group project and everybody's working kind of at the same time. And so a lot of these files are connected to one another through references. And so if I'm currently doing the character rig, like we were talking about in this example, if I'm currently messing around in my character rig, if the person in the character model file is just making, and pretend it says references, making little changes willy-nilly and saving, even though I don't want his current version of the character model yet, I'm trying to get something done, all of a sudden little changes are going to start popping up on my character inside the rig file. And so because of that reference link between the two files, it creates this kind of disruption in the workflow, and it makes it hard for someone to work. Okay. So imagine that you're making a house of cards, right? And so you're busy up at the top stacking up the next level of cards, but then someone in your group decided to go to the bottom of the house of cards and start making tweaks down there too, right? So obviously that's going to disrupt what you're doing up top and maybe even make everything kind of crash to a halt. So usually what we do is we use release files, and it's kind of like you're saying, hey, I'm done with this file. You're welcome to go ahead and use it now. And so that would be like that person at the bottom of that house of cards, building that house of cards, saying like, okay, I'm done messing around with this part down here. You're good to go to build the next level or work on the next level. That doesn't mean that that file is completely done. So if I'm doing the character model and I'm going to be bringing it to the character rig, right? That when I do referencing, that doesn't necessarily mean I have to be completely done with the model before you start working on the rig. but there needs to be communication between the person working on this file and the person working on the other file that's referencing it when there's changes being made. So usually we work in what's called a working file, and so that's where I'm making all my changes. I'm free to make all the edits I want. And so when we're working with references, we really want to make sure we are properly cleaning up our files before we start referencing them between other Maya files. This is good practice for every project and when you're working with other people to prevent corruption issues between Maya versions, or even just to make things cleaner and easier to work with. So I'll show you in Maya some of these things, but first I just want to go through a step list or checklist. First things first is you want to make sure your object is centered in your scene, and you want to set its pivot point to be aligned with the origin. So essentially centering your object and its pivot point in the space. You want to freeze your transformations so that your transform values on your objects are zeroed out. And this is going to be especially useful for geometry and animation controls. Obviously, when you're doing animation, you don't want to freeze your transformations or anything like that. But when you're done modeling your object and you're getting ready to send it forward down the pipeline to another file or to another person, you want to freeze your transformations in that file. You want to delete your history on all of your modeling assets. You want to give everything a useful name that is easy to understand at a glance. You want to put your objects into a group, and that group should be centered in the scene if all your objects are centered in the scene, but also just double check and make sure your group is also centered in the scene. And you'll also want to save your files and make backups. So let me go ahead and open this in Maya. So here I have this character. And so each of these assets, let me go ahead and grab each of these assets and center their pivots. So you can see each of these assets have their own pivot point, but that pivot point is centered more or less with the character. My character is symmetrical, perfectly symmetrical across, so your character might not necessarily be symmetrical, but each object, so let's say I had let's go ahead and duplicate this object. Say she had a button on her shoulder, right? So let's just move one over there. Okay. This pivot point is probably fine to keep, and I'll talk about why this is probably okay. Let me turn off snapping. But what you might want to do is you might want to actually set its pivot point to be in the center of your character, right? This has a variety of uses. So what you can do is you can mirror this across the center of your character. So if I take this and I go ahead and mirror it, right? I can flip it perfectly across my character. This step isn't super necessary. You can have your pivot point kind of off the center if you want to. And then, of course, I'd want to freeze my transformation values. Let's go ahead and Control-Z that back, and then we'll freeze the transform values. Okay. What I like to do is, even though not everything has a center point that lines up with the middle of my the center of my scene, my character at least is lined up with the center of my scene, right? Then what I like to do is I take my whole character, or take this object, this like let's say it's a dresser with drawers in it, and each of those are separate objects. Each of those objects in that dresser drawer I'd group together, or if it's a character, I group all the objects associated with that character together in a group. What this does is, and again, make sure it's centered in scene. What this does is it makes it easy for if another one of my teammates, let's say, drops in or references in my file to be placed somewhere in my their environment. So let's say they want to move the character over here, and they might even want to scale them down to fit in the scene, right? And they have all this like elaborate set dressing going on. So I went ahead and just opened the Pixar Pup Cabin. So this is one of the resources that are used for the Pixar undergraduate program, I think is what it's called. And they release these assets for free online. So I just loaded this in because I wanted to show you an example of an environment. And so I went ahead and create that reference. So because I centered that object, let's show where the grid is on my in my scene file. I think. Show grid. Okay, it's probably somewhere in here. Let's turn on. There it is. It's right there. If I'm doing the set dressing, so let's say I'm the set dressing artist, I'm placing all the models and posing them in the space. This is going to make it really easy for me to navigate and understand the files that I bring in. So I'm going to go File, Create Reference, or Import. bring my character in. So my character has that file. It comes in right where I expect it in the center of the scene. Has that group, is what I meant to say. I can scale her down. Let's go show, selection highlighting. And it's really easy for me to now manage and edit my character and put him into space. So she doesn't have a full body, obviously, but if I wanted to like put her sitting into this chair, there we go. Pretty easy to do. So by having that all managed inside of a group and having that centered in the space and having all my transform values zeroed out, it was really easy for me to manage and understand this character, how I'm moving them in the space when I'm doing the set dressing and animation later on. We want to go ahead and make sure our objects have easy to understand names. So right now this group doesn't have a great name and these all have this bat file name in front of it. So I'm just going to call this one my character underscore capital GEO. So what I like to use is I like to use a descriptive name for the first part, underscore, and then a specification for what type of object it is. So for instance, the character's head, I might do head underscore GEO. Oh, for character geo, I should probably call this character group. This is going to be the group for containing the character. And this is a geometry object, so head geo. And if I have, like this button right here is on her left shoulder, what I might call this one is left shoulder underscore geo. And then I'll also use something like underscore L or underscore R to specify the left or the right hand side of the body. So if I selected this, let's go ahead and set the pivot point here. And I'm going to make a duplicate version of it. So let's duplicate that and I'm going to mirror it across. I'm just doing this kind of messily. So let's do this one. Okay. So I want to mirror across on the other side. This other one I would call underscore R to specify that. So left shoulder button. So I should call it button. Underscore geo underscore left or right. So that's a good habit to get into. One for just understanding when you look through a bunch of assets, it's easy at a glance to understand what you're looking at. If everything's named polysphere 1, 2, 3, 13, 40, and nothing is really given a descriptive name. And once you have a bunch of assets, especially the person doing stuff later down the line, whether it's the rigging artist or the set dressing artist, they're going to have a heck of a time understanding what you're doing. It also is really useful for certain things, like you can select everything through a mel script, everything that has underscore geo with it, or everything that has on the left hand side by just using a simple like name search and searching for certain characters or strings in your file.